Hello, audience, and welcome to another Daniel Greene Gives Writing Advice video. And this one is inspired by the fact that I recently have been writing fight scenes in my own book, and because of that, I've been going back and reading through some of my favorites of all time in the history of the genre. Like, literally, I've been going all the way back to, like, Beowulf, up to recent releases like Kings of the Wild, and seeing what made me invest the most in various fight scenes. Now, to be clear, this isn't necessarily about the style of writing the fights. I'm not focusing on that. I'm more focusing in this video around the situation of how the fight plays out and the build-up to it. If you'd like a video about the style of writing fights, I'm actually going to link to a Hello Future Me video that I collaborated with him on, linked right down there, about the various styles of how to write combat. But in this video, I want to talk about how you can properly approach and execute fights between characters and maintain believability even with differing power levels in character, because that is something a lot of people struggle with. It's difficult if you are writing a fantasy book and have your farm boy who's been, training the last few hundred pages to go up against the big bad guy to actually believably take him down. To make it very clear, I'm going to use something that's going to seem oversimplifying, but it's going to do a good job here, and that's going to be a tier list right by my head. I know they're overused, and trust me, I'm cutting down on tier lists in the channel, but this is going to be a good visual representation of how to properly write differences in power and what's required to maintain stakes and believability in combat. So the easiest to write, obviously, is two characters that are on the same tier, regardless of whichever one. Let's say you have two B tiers going against each other. They're B tier, they're powerful, maybe they got some magical abilities, maybe they even have the same class, and they can just go at with a similar level of experience. You don't need to do a whole lot within the narrative to maintain believability in the writing of this, obviously, because they're already there matched up. And because of that, you have stakes within your writing and you won't need to do a great amount of effort to pour in more. Obviously, I still encourage you to do so. It's never a bad thing to work on the stakes of a given scene, but here there's just going to be enough inherent stakes for you not to have to worry about it too much outside of whatever you'd like to pepper in. Same goes for characters that are just one tier level apart. Granted, I would still recommend consciously putting in more effort here to justify a victory if the weaker character is still supposed to win, and maybe take a step here or there to level the playing field from the beginning. Or you can have what they call a desperate matchup, where the person on the lower level is just going all out, bringing it hard, and doing their best to maintain their ability to survive. And that's actually kind of in some ways a more inherently compelling fight. And this is actually still a very comfortable level to be in as an author. The discomfort comes when we take it one more level of separation. Now let's say we have an A tier versus a C tier. So here's where the meat of this video is going to come into play. Now you have to justify a victory. It will be disappointing for a reader if they read a fight between characters on this much of a discrepancy that you can't just have a victory play out for one and it not take great effort to justify what happened here. Now, you can have some of these similar elements come into play at any level, but now it's almost a requirement for them to do so. It could be environmental factors, outsmarting the enemy is something that could still come into play here. If you have a character that has a buffed intelligence stat, it could play well into the narrative. But let's say you haven't even set that up and you can't just suddenly put it in there and it feel earned. This is actually a misconception in writing fights where people go, oh, I'll just have my character outsmart them, but they've never established this character is specifically intelligent, especially when it comes to combat smarts. So even if that justification comes into play, it doesn't feel super earned. So other things need to come into play here for your character's victory to feel okay. Maybe the person they're going up against who's in the higher tier is already exhausted. They've been fighting before. Environmental factors are something I actually would love to see more people play with. I've seen a few authors bring environmental factors into their fight scenes and it pay off extremely well. It can sound cheap to have the cliche example, I have the high ground, play a major role. But in reality, it's actually very realistic. That is something that matters in a fight. And if your character is not necessarily extraordinarily smart enough, doesn't take a genius, but by happenstance or through certain circumstances is able to maintain an environmental advantage, that won't break your reader's investment. I promise you, especially if you handle it well. You can have comedic even resolutions where you have people like a tier apart resolve in a way because a rock falls in someone's head. There's one particular instance from amazing author Joe Abercrombie where an environmental factor literally solves a fight in one of his stories. I won't say for spoilers, but that is the resolution of a fight, and it pays off. But the only reason it works for him is already it wasn't too much of a discrepancy between power, so it doesn't feel like a cop-out because it could have gone other ways in general. It only happens then. It's not something he's repeatedly doing, and in Joe Abercrombie's specific writing style, an environmental thing like that is very realistic could happen in the real world doesn't seem crazy out of place, because that does legitimately happen. People trip over stones. So that's the kind of environmental play I also encourage you to look into. But don't have your S tier people fall on a stone and it costs them the fight. Don't do that. Sauron shouldn't die because he trips and falls into the lavas of Mount Doom. Next up, there's the items, there's the tools, there's MacGuffins. These you need to be more careful with because they can feel like what they are if you are not tactful. This is where you need to actually have, again, a long earned setup. Here is why this character is able to achieve victory. Something that has spanned a good portion of your book. Having them just stumble across a magical weapon and use it is not going to fit into your text, and people will complain. I promise you that. And here's where the real advice is going to come in. Small seeds to plant earlier in the story that will pay off. You can have an A-tier villain or character in general going against a lower tier, but if you as the author have taken the time to plant seeds in a reader's mind about their flaws, that while they are earned here, they can be exploited in certain ways, and the character going against them has knowledge of that, or just by their own existence fills a kind of gap and can expand and exploit some of the flaws set up for a higher tier enemy. This could be they are very egotistical and would play with their food, so to speak, which could open up vulnerabilities within the fight. This could be they have certain problems with a magic system. Maybe it's a limited factor. If you have a harder magic system, these are very nice to play with and can fit, just tuck right on into your story. All kinds of meta things to work earlier on in the story to set up, to pay off for whatever climax you're having here. Now, a good example of this level of discrepancy that does actually play out and pay off quite well, I would say is, I know there's a lot of controversy around this series right now, but hear me out. Harry Potter versus Voldemort. Voldemort is the King Dark Wizard, right? He's the big Mac Daddy. The only person he's afraid of is Dumbledore. He is a better evil wizard, more powerful than Harry. But in the final fight between these two, not many people complain about how Harry pulls off his W because we know explicitly how well Harry exploits many insecurities in Voldemort, how well he actually just kind of is the foil that fits in those gaps that make Voldemort so weak. He has friends, he has people backing him up. Voldemort's hubris is huge. Voldemort thinks he has a MacGuffin wand, which actually isn't working for him. He can't see his own failure. And Harry, being someone who is very plot armory, don't get me wrong, but again, that's consistent throughout the story, so even in this final fight, it doesn't feel jarring. And that's actually something I want to push back against that's in a popular narrative, that plot armor is inherently a bad thing. No, plot armor exists in every book, and it's something that you shouldn't actively try and have zero of within your story. Plot armor is a good thing in writing because we don't want our characters to die, and if you're afraid to ever write a circumstance where it'll feel like there's plot armor letting them come out alive, then guess what? You aren't going to be able to reach the highs in terms of stakes and narratively other authors who don't flinch away from this do. So be conscious of plot armor and use it to your advantage. Hell, you can go as far as Robert Jordan and for one character, write the plot armor into the story and make it a part of their powers and abilities. That's just something he decided to go, screw it. The plot armor is literally a point within the text. That works out pretty well. And I don't think many people actually have a big problem with it as long as you are conscious of it and maybe put some ramifications every time the plot armor comes into play. Yes, okay, this person survived, but there was a cost. That way it is plot armor, but it doesn't feel completely bulletproof. There are vulnerabilities. It more or less, the plot armor muted the damage instead of getting rid of it altogether. Now we have the even greater steps of separation we need to talk about. And this is when these people are on essentially opposite ends of the tier list. They are as far apart as they could be in text. This is Frodo Baggins in the Shire versus Sauron sitting in Mount Doom. It's not ideal. And my advice would be never to write a combat situation where two characters like this just flat out go at it and the bottom person has to win, because it's not going to feel right unless you take extraordinary efforts to justify it. And it takes a masterclass author to have this pay off in a satisfying way that doesn't feel plot armor MacGuffin-y BS, and readers will typically call you out on it. There are examples of this being done okay in literature, but they're few and far between, and they're from veterans of the craft typically, or just prodigies who are just next level and understand how to set this up. If you are going to have this kind of showdown and it pay out in a certain way, oh man, you need to essentially be planting seeds and working to show how this could go in the way you want from the beginning. This needs to be something that there is constant effort for to have pay off. And I just, in general, don't recommend getting into it, because especially if you're the kind of person who's just writing their first couple stories, it's just not going to work out for you. And I'm not trying to say that in a talking down to manner. It's just like a matter of experience. This is like someone trying to get in a NASCAR vehicle when they don't even have their learner's permit. It's a risky situation, and I would instead focus on writing stories that have not quite as a big a power difference within the heart of where the conflict, the climax, needs to go. There's a reason why Sauron isn't waiting for Frodo in Mount Doom, because Tolkien knew narratively he couldn't go that route. So he worked around it. And so I recommend, if you have a situation where you are having your little young person who's not a fighter, who's in any tier but the lowest, trying to accomplish a goal against this grand authoritative figure, trust Tolkien. Generally, that's a good rule. Just write away where their end mission, their end goal, isn't a direct conflict. So let's get a little bit of summary here. Characters on the same level. These are the ones that are pretty much the easiest to write. They come free with stakes and investment because you know these characters are set up on a similar level, and you can have a lot of fun there. Two students attending the same combat school who are at the same level going at it, immediately you're just like, oh, okay, who's gonna win? I don't know. And I also recommend trying to maybe put some victories on some sides within this that you don't necessarily think would be within your text. Let your hero lose some fights at this level along the way, and that way it could show they're more touchable, they're more vulnerable, and if you have plot armor later on, save them at cost, it can still have the feeling of like, this person isn't untouchable, they've lost before, but here we're just showing, you know, you can do whatever you want here, and it's great. The one apart, try and justify it, maybe bring in some environmental factors, but you don't have to be that worried, because usually readers will be forgiving here, because usually the person you want to win is the good guy, and everyone just at this point in life and day and age understands the good guy's gonna typically win. So yeah, this one's still fine. Now we enter the warning zone, 2 levels apart. This is where planting seeds earlier on, lots of setup, really showing a journey that leads up to this conflict and is well cemented in the reader's mind. Consciously or not, there are ways that the person on the lower level could win is very important. You need those for this to not cause some issues within your text, and you as an author to avoid the accusations of overuse of plot armor and things like that. And this is where your consciousness of plot armor needs to be more heavily considered as a writer. Again, do not think all plot armor is a bad thing. I'm gonna keep telling that to people. Plot armor can be fine, as long as you put some cost in there and don't overuse and abuse it. Or you can go the Robert Jordan route and just cheat and make it a part of the text, and very few people will complain because you've written it into the established lore. That's also a good method to do here. I just noticed my sleeve was rolled this whole video. Great. And now we leave the warning zone, and anything beyond this is danger zone, because you're having a level of power discrepancy that's almost beyond David and Goliath. This is David versus godly figure, and it's hard. This is where you need that veteran experience and a lot of time and effort planting seeds in the mind of the reader and putting in environmental factors and maybe some magical items. Just so much needs to happen here for justification. It's not impossible, but boy, do you need to spend an extraordinary amount of time justifying it and setting it up and really weaving into the text, character-wise, environmental-wise, everything needs to line up perfectly for this to feel like a satisfactory conclusion to the ending. And I would just be very conscious of where your various characters lie within this tier list. I literally have a tier list for the characters I'm writing for my book. It's laid out, and I know where each one falls at various points in the story. So I have like 5 different ones for various points, because characters are increasing and decreasing in power, and this allows me to go, okay, what would be a good conflict to arise here? Actually, the grand power discrepancy conflicts typically want to go at either the very beginning or the very end of the story. That big loss for your character followed up by the comeback. These are things that usually happened at the tail beginnings or ends of your overall story. So just keep that in mind as well. But I hope this helps you understand the various levels of effort required to really build up, set up, and pay off conflict within your own story. It's not easy the further apart you get. But this has been a quickie, kind of just Daniel recommends how to handle conflict and stakes within writing your combat, your fights for your stories. Let me know what you think of this video in the comments down below. Do you disagree? Do you think, no, it's very easy to write Frodo going up to Sauron and stabbing him in the chest? I'm very curious to hear that argument if someone's gonna have it. Let me know in the comments down below. Like and subscribe if you have not already. Hit the Patreon if you want to support what I do here. And have a good one, y'all. Peace.